Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today's episode is a books episode. We are reviewing the best books of 2022, the best books that I've read in the past year. We do this twice a year. If you want to, you can see the episode we did for the first half of 2022. We'll link that in the show notes. This episode will be reviewing books that I read in the second half of 2022 and giving a kind of best of top 5 list of the best books I read at any point in the past year. This includes academic work, nonfiction. This includes science fiction and fantasy works that I've read. I like to read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. It includes stuff from economics, political science, all sorts of different fields. And as I said, we do this every year, and I hope you enjoy it. Quick note before we do get started, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so via our Patreon account. That's patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism, and members get access to really cool stuff like bonus episodes of the podcast, customized membership card, discount at our store, access to our community Slack where all the insiders post. So if you want to do that, you can become a member at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Now, with that said, let's jump straight into the episode. Now, the first couple of books that we're going to be reviewing are books that I am giving kind of a negative review to. Usually in these episodes, I only have a couple books out of like dozens that I'm just not a fan of that I wouldn't recommend. This year I actually had several. This year I had more books than normal, I would say, that I ended up just not really enjoying. I didn't think they were worth the time. And we're going to review a couple of them here. Some of them are going to be sprinkled throughout the episode, but I'm going to start off with 2 books that unfortunately I can't recommend fully. They may have some redeeming qualities, but I also have a bone to pick in some sense with these books. The very first one is called Quackery. Quackery is by Lydia Kang and Nate Peterson, and the subtitle of the book is Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Way to Cure Everything. So I picked this up because I thought it would be interesting to kind of read about the history of quack cures, of quack medicine, and of all sorts of interesting, pre-modern medicine thinking about how do you cure people's diseases. The way the book is structured is that it goes through different kind of categories of quack cures. There's a section on the elements. People used to think mercury could cure all sorts of things. They used to think arsenic could cure things, or gold, or radium. That was a mistake. There's a section on plants and soil, opiates, cocaine, tobacco, literally eating dirt. There's a section on tools like bloodletting and lobotomies and enemas and weird surgeries that people used to get. There's a section on animals like animal-derived medicines and leeches and all sorts of stuff. And I was hoping the book would be like this really interesting thing that would grip me and would pull me in. And the book does what it says it's going to do. It doesn't have that thing that actually makes you want to keep reading. You know the difference, if you've ever read a book, between a book that you have to struggle through and a book that like grips you and is a page turner and you can't put it down. This book is just not that. I found myself, reading a couple chapters and kind of getting bored with it and setting it down and doing something else. And then I would try to come back to it and would read one more chapter. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly what it is, but just something about the writing style or the structure or something just did not hook me. I do think that the book has a lot of interesting information. And, if you're deeply interested in the subject of quackery and quack medicine, fake medicine, then maybe you would be interested in this. But for me, I'm not really sure that I can recommend this wholeheartedly. because it just doesn't have that it factor. It doesn't have that readability that makes me want to keep reading. So unfortunately, I'm giving this kind of a meh review, not like a fully negative review, but a little bit of a half-hearted shrug of the shoulders to this one. Quackery by Lydia Kang and Nate Peterson. The second book that I have to give kind of a half-hearted, kind of good, kind of bad recommendation to is What We Owe the Future by Will MacAskill. What We Owe the Future is a book about effective altruism, and specifically, it focuses on a branch of effective altruism known as long-termism. Long-termism is essentially a philosophy, a school of thought that says future lives, future humans, or future conscious beings matter just as much as current lives, and there's potential for a lot of lives in the future. It could be that we have hundreds of billions or even trillions of people who are yet to live, future humans or future beings, and therefore the most important moral actions we can take are actions that will impact the future of humanity or the future of conscious life. And that is where a lot of our effort should be going. The book is good in some ways. It's reasonably well written. It's easy to read, and I think it's good that there's a book on this subject. And I'm glad that somebody is out there writing about this and raising awareness for the sorts of things that Will MacAskill is trying to raise awareness for. But I also think that in some ways the book fails because it doesn't convince me. And I am pretty much the target audience here. I am like the picture perfect target of the person that this book is going to be able to convince and should convince if it's well written and if it's succeeding. And unfortunately, I'm not convinced by some of the core arguments in the book. So why am I unconvinced here? I think the parts of the book that work, the parts that are worth reading, are not really a defense of long-termism. They're a defense of medium-termism. You know, there are things that people think might, really destroy the world in the next 50 years or so. But that is not really a defense of long-termism. Long-termism is about the centuries in the future, thousands of years in the future, humans expanding to other planets and to other solar systems maybe, and like the trillions of future humans argument. That is what I consider real long-termism to be, and what long-termists will talk to you about. MacAskill in his book almost exclusively focuses on things that will potentially be threats, according to some people, in the next 20 to 50 years. Climate change, nuclear war, AI superintelligence. Regardless of whether or not you think these things are real threats or fake threats, in particular, there's a lot of dialogue about AI. Is it going to kill us all or not? But whether or not you agree with that, there are some people who think that, but they don't think that it's going to kill us in 1,000 years. They think that it's going to kill us in 20 years. So I'm confused about where are the actual long-termist arguments here. Everything that's in the book is very medium-termist. And yeah, you don't really need a lot of complicated moral philosophy to make the argument that we should try to prevent nuclear war if it's going to pop up within a couple decades. Nuclear war in 30 years' time, you don't need a separate book to argue about long-termism for that. Everybody would agree that's bad. In addition, I kind of think the argument for actual long-termism continues to be weak. Even if you accept the premises, let's say, kind of the two premises of long-termism are, number one, that future lives matter as much as current lives. Let's accept that for now. And number two, we might have many, many, many potential future lives. We could have 1 trillion future humans. And so that's a big deal. Even if you accept that, I don't think it follows that we can credibly spend our time and our efforts trying to improve like the future trillions of people's lives. I think that the argument for doing so has some potential, but that there are serious counter arguments that are just only weakly indicated in the book or kind of hand waved away. One of the serious arguments I have with the long-termist position is that I think it's just fundamentally impossible to know how your actions will affect the world on the course of like 1,000 years' time or longer. You know, we can predict what our actions might be doing in 20 years. That's really difficult, but it's possible. But if you're talking about like, what am I as an individual doing and how might that affect humanity 10,000 years in the future, and you say you have a definite idea of what that might be, I just don't believe you, frankly. Imagine somebody in the year 1000, some monk in a medieval European monastery or something, thinking about how they could impact the year 2000. They would have no idea how to do that. And they might have some guesses, but they'd probably be wildly wrong. And furthermore, their value system was something that they probably wouldn't even, recognize compared to our value system. They might be trying to lock in changes in a way that we would think was destructive. You also get into this problem when you deal with very, very long-term things, very, very long timelines, very, very big population numbers, the dangers of like small risks that might be small percentages. You end up making a lot of really heroic assumptions, I will say, where, you're like, well, I don't know what this number is. It can't be estimated precisely, but let's just call it a 2% risk. But you have no idea if that's right. What if it's a 0.02% risk? You could be several orders of magnitude off and have no idea. And that influences all these hypothetical calculations you're doing. And these calculations are so incredibly filled with assumptions, really strong assumptions that are critical to the calculations, that I don't think that is examined enough in some of these long-termist points of view. And basically, you end up in a situation where anybody can kind of dream up a scenario that seems unlikely, but that would be dangerous to like trillions of future people. And so you say, well, okay, it's unlikely, but it's, multiplied by so many people over so many years that we need to take serious action to make sure it doesn't happen. But anybody can do that. Anybody can dream up a scenario. What if we adopt dolphins as pets and they evolve until they're as smart as us, and then they murder every human? That's a tiny possibility, but what if it happens? Like you're kind of in thrall to my imagination more so than you are to like reality in some sense. What scenarios do I personally think about a lot is kind of where the long-termist priorities go. So, I struggle with this one because I'm glad Will wrote the book. I think it's a valuable contribution to like the thought process we should be going through in effective altruism and in these kind of related communities. But at the same time, I don't think it's the best version of this book that could have been written, and it fails to convince me in some important ways. So that is What We Owe the Future by Will MacAskill. All right, so let's talk about a couple of books that I did enjoy this year. One thing that I did a lot this year was read Francis Fukuyama. I read 3 different Frank Fukuyama books this year, and enjoyed all of them, all 3 positive reviews. I'm going to talk about 2 of them now. One of them is actually, we're going to delay because it's going to be in the top 5 books. That'll come at the end of the episode. Top 5 is always at the very end. You got to wait for the good stuff here. But the first 2 books I want to talk about are The End of History and Liberalism and Its Discontents, both by Francis Fukuyama. So The End of History is technically titled The End of History and the Last Man. It was a book written in 1992, and it has gained some infamy over the last few decades. Basically, the argument of the book is that history has ended and liberal democracy is our final state. And this is a much more complex argument than it is typically given credit for. If you actually read the book, it is filled with nuance and kind of a particular set of conditions under which this applies. But Frank Fukuyama wrote this in 1992 as the Soviet Union had just collapsed. We were watching the communist world crumble before our eyes, and the thesis of the book is that the grand ideological struggle between different competing systems of how to be a state and how to run a government, those have been decided. There is one final state that is kind of the most advanced state. In order to believe this, you have to believe that humanity goes through states, that, there are different levels of government. You can go from kind of the anarchic hunter-gatherers to kind of the proto-city states to kind of feudalism and monarchy to liberalism. Liberal democracies are what we had. And, along the way in the 20th century, there was a real question. Is liberal democracy going to make it? Is liberal democracy actually the best and highest form of government? There were people who thought no. There were fascists who tried to build, nation states in Germany and Spain and Italy, and they said fascism is more advanced than liberal democracy. We will outcompete you. Fascism will take over the world. It turns out that was not the case. Germany and Spain and Italy are now all liberal democracies, and fascism failed. You also had communist states like the USSR and a few others. Obviously, there was Vietnam and Cuba and North Korea, if you want to call them communist, and some of the satellite states of the USSR. And they said communism is the final state. Liberal democracy is just either a transitory period or it turns into fascism. But communism is the most advanced state, and everybody's going to be communist at some point in the future. This is the future. And it turns out they were wrong. The USSR collapsed. All of their satellite states abandoned communism. Even places like China and Vietnam, while still nominally communist, are free market capitalist in important ways as well. And through the 20th century, we saw this long, slow movement. And it goes in fits and starts, but through the 20th century, we saw lots and lots of countries, more and more often, were becoming liberal democracies. And importantly, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of movement in the other direction. It's pretty rare for a liberal democracy to collapse backwards into an autocracy. But it was fairly common for an autocracy or a dictatorship to kind of have their government collapse and a liberal democracy form out of that. So Frank Fukuyama basically says there is no stage beyond liberal democracy. That is the final stage. It doesn't mean that wars are never going to stop happening. There will still be wars as we work out the kinks and as, different countries have conflicts and as dictatorships fall. But his thesis is that over time, slowly, everyone becomes a liberal democracy. That is the end of history, in the sense that history is a historical process, in the sense that history is a thing that we all go through as societies and cultures. The process of history has an end point, and it is liberal democracy. Now, I got a chance to talk with Frank Fukuyama on the podcast, and he was fantastic. He was a very gracious guest, very, very perceptive and intelligent guy, to say the least, and got to talk with him about how this thesis has held up. Obviously, in 1992, it was a big moment for liberal democracy. Communism was failing. Lots of states were transitioning into democracy. But over the next few decades, through the 2000s and 2010s, a lot of people started to make fun of this thesis because of the rise of totalitarian China, that China seemed under Xi Jinping to kind of backtrack and become more like a dictatorship. Russia and Putin did not become a democracy. They became a different form of dictatorship than they had before. And you started to see the rise of people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Erdogan and Duterte and a lot of these kind of like pseudo far-right strongmen in many different countries. And so people started to say, well, maybe liberal democracy actually is in danger. Maybe we're going to see a wide range of countries losing democracy. And so this book is crap. But then in the last year, it's really been quite a good year for democracy, in that you've seen a lot of the supposed new wave, the future of government kind of things. China and Russia want to sell that they have a different form of government that's going to work even better than liberal democracy, but they've been struggling hard. And liberal democracies have staged somewhat of a comeback. And so we talked about that. I really enjoyed the book. I think it's definitely worth reading. It's a dense book. You're going to have to work your way through it. It's a little bit of effort. But The End of History and The Last Man, absolutely worth reading, from Frank Fukuyama. The second Fukuyama book I want to talk about is Liberalism and Its Discontents. So I enjoyed all three of the Frank Fukuyama books that I read this year. This one would probably be third in the list. It would probably be my least favorite. But I still enjoyed it. I still think it's a good book, just not quite as inordinately impressive as the other two. Liberalism and Its Discontents is about that factor that I just talked about, that in the mid-2010s, it certainly seemed like liberalism was undergoing quite a number of challenges and had quite a number of mountains to climb. It looked like there were challenges from within and challenges from without, and that liberalism might be struggling, in a sense. It was published in 2022, but I really think of it as a book of the 2010s. The ideas of this book are kind of the ideas of the mid and late 2010s, because by the end of 2022, I think a lot of the questions that this book poses had been answered. But the book is about those challenges that liberalism was facing. Fukuyama talks about challenges both from the right and left. From the right, it's obviously, the challenges of authoritarianism. And we talked about some of the bad actors, the Brexiteers and the far right in England, in the European parties like the National Front in France and Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. And there's several others. I won't run through every country, but, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Erdogan, Modi in India to some extent, Trump in the US, even Canada, perfect, peaceful Canada, has kind of this explosion of far-right weirdos that have come out. And it's a genuine threat to democracy and to liberalism, and it's posing a challenge to the system. Fukuyama also talks about challenges to liberalism from the left. And he does specify that, in his view, the challenges from the right are a lot more serious. They are a lot more dangerous, but that he's worried that the left is giving up on liberal principles as well. He's concerned about the rise of kind of identitarian politics as opposed to commitment to liberal principles like free speech, free association, things like that. And he worries about kind of the left's take on some of those principles. I do think there's a couple weak points in the book. I would have to call out that, I think that he does a typically lazy thing that academics sometimes do, in that they toss out a neoliberalism is to blame kind of thing. And he does that here. There's one or two instances where he says, well, a lot of this is liberalism's own fault because we did the neoliberalism and therefore blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't really develop that argument. And frankly, I think if you ask him, he would also tell you that the book doesn't develop that argument very well. It kind of throws it out as an accusation without building the case. And I think it's a weak point in the book. And I only say this, obviously, I'm biased. You know which podcast you're listening to. This is the Neoliberal Podcast, so I am going to stick up for neoliberalism. But I think, in his other books, he goes to great lengths to build factual cases, to give historical examples. And this is a shorter book than either of the other two I read. It's a much shorter book than The End of History. So it just doesn't have the length and the depth. But it's kind of tossed out that, we did a bunch of neoliberalism. That's why everyone is unhappy, which I am skeptical of. I don't think that neoliberalism can be blamed for, let's say, the far-right resurgence, when that far-right resurgence has been, taking place in so many wildly different countries, like the Philippines and Turkey and Brazil and America and Germany. Like, if this is happening in wildly different contexts everywhere, it's probably not like that the U.S. government cut welfare at some point. That's not why it happened. So that's my one quibble with the book. Other than that, I think Liberalism and Its Discontents is a good book, worth reading, and kind of gives you some insight into the challenges that liberalism is facing and hopefully overcoming right now. one other shout out to Frank Fukuyama before we move on. I'm looking forward to reading his book Identity later this year. It's already on my bookshelf. I've already got it, so that one will probably be coming in our next books episode. But definitely check out these previous two from Fukuyama and stay tuned for the third one. Now, before we get into any more, serious political science academic books, I want to talk about some science fiction and some fantasy that I read this year. This is about the halfway point of the episode, so we're going to take a little interlude into sci-fi and fantasy that I have read in the second half of 2022. So I warned you at the beginning of the episode that there were a bunch of books that I just unfortunately didn't vibe with this year. Unfortunately, several of them came in this category. The first one I will talk about is a web serial named Millennial Mage. Now, if you've listened to this podcast before, if you've listened to the books episodes before, you know that I am a fan of a format that is called web serials. They're books that are published online, basically. They're published as blogs, and every blog entry is like a chapter of the book. So usually the way the author will have it set up is they write like one chapter a week, and it's published on their blog or whatever, and you can kind of, if you're reading it for the first time, you can just click through all the blog entries, and sometimes you'd be surprised how good the writing can be for some of these web serials. I've read a bunch of them. I typically enjoy them. A lot of them, it's really, really heavy into science fiction and fantasy. And I read one this year called Millennial Mage, and unfortunately, I got like 50 chapters in, and I just couldn't keep going. It was one of those books you had to quit because it was too bad. It wasn't really all that well written. And look, science fiction and fantasy, there's usually some weird elements to the plot. There's usually some level of acceptance that you have to have that, the person that you're following is the special person and they have all sorts of cool things happen to them and they're faster and smarter and stronger and more clever than everybody else, and so they're the hero, right? And you accept this because, look, it's a story. They're following certain templates. There's the hero's journey. When you watch an action movie, you don't really complain that the action hero hits all their shots that they fire from their gun. You don't say, well, it's unrealistic how many they hit. Like, to a certain extent, you just accept this, that they are the special one. Millennial Mage took that to potentially the greatest extreme that I've ever seen. It was almost embarrassing how quickly they started from like, let's start with our protagonist who's like a new mage. It's a world with magic and wizards and whatever. It's a fantasy world. And this kind of person is like brand new and doesn't know anything, and they have to learn how the magic works and learn how the rules of the world work. And as they learn it, the reader is also learning about the rules of the world. Within like 5 chapters or something absurd, this person has existed in this world for like a week or two, and they're already doing stuff that is like, whoa, nobody's done that thing in 700 years, and you've done it. And it was honestly like I felt a little viscerally embarrassed for how quickly this like brand new neophyte, never done anything before character, who's the main character, was just like, for no reason at all, 10 times better than everyone else at every single magical task. I couldn't stick. I heroically tried to stick with it because apparently this is a popular web serial. Apparently a lot of people read it and like it, but it was a little too much for me. So a negative review to Millennial Mage. There is a better version of it that we're going to be talking about in the top 5 at the end of the episode. A better web serial. So stay tuned for that. Another sci-fi series that I read this year was Rory Thorne. So there's a couple books here. The first one is How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Multiverse. The second one is titled appropriately, How the Multiverse Got Its Revenge. These are both books by Kay Eason, and they are science fiction books, set in the same world. The second one is a sequel to the first one. It's called The Rory Thorne Chronicles. I liked the first one. I didn't like the second one. That's the punchline here. The first book is interesting, and it's honestly not a great book on its own, but it does a decent enough job setting up the setting up the characters and setting up the world that you're kind of you're invested into it. You're building up to something and you think, okay, they've kind of maybe created something interesting here. The main character is, of course, Rory Thorne, and she is living on a planet. There's kind of a planet galactic empire or some sort of situation going on. There's a lot of planets. Some of them are at war with other ones. Some of them are in alliances with other ones. And she is a princess of one of these planets, and she was gifted some sort of magical ability to always know what people are truly thinking. So you can imagine, if you asked somebody, you're coming to my birthday, right? Aren't you, and they were like, yeah, I'm definitely going to make it. And at the same time they were saying those words out loud, you would hear in your head, no, I hate you, and I'm going to find an excuse not to go, right? Like that kind of thing. You can always hear what people's actual meaning is. You always know what they are actually thinking or actually meaning. Their words, they can't lie to you. So she's got this cool ability, and she finds herself in a precarious political position because there's shenanigans going on in the Galactic Empire. And it's an interesting enough book. It's not a great book. The world feels oddly small. I don't really know how to explain that so much, but like there are certain books you read where the world building feels huge and epic and like vast in scale. Think about like Dune. Dune is just set on one planet basically, with some very minor exceptions, but it feels like this richly realized universe. You just feel like you're in that just vast, cool, expansive universe. I would say Game of Thrones is also like this, where, the first Game of Thrones book is mostly in one or two places, but you feel like it's part of this rich, incredibly complex world, Westeros and Essos and the whole Seven Kingdoms and blah, 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 blah. This book felt like the opposite of that. Like technically it's in many different locations and there's different civilizations and different races of people and different kinds of aliens and stuff like that. But for some reason, it just feels small. It feels like very contained and small. It does not feel vast. And unfortunately, the flaws there come out in the second book. In the second book, it's a continuation of Rory Thorne's story, but I don't think it takes advantage of the potential energy there in the world very well. Potentially, there could be this vast, expansive, cool universe. It doesn't really deliver on that promise. It also just kind of forgets that she has this magical ability. She uses it like once or twice in the second book. That magical ability to tell if people are telling the truth or not, to tell their true intentions, is key to the first book. It is like the central thing that helps her get through a bunch of the plot points, and it's worked in pretty well. And they almost just forget that she has that in the second book, other than once or twice. So the second book is just a dud, frankly. It's not very good. So if you're looking for some sci-fi, the first Rory Thorne book is decent. It's not bad. The second one, I can't recommend at all. Those two books are How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Multiverse and How the Multiverse Got Its Revenge by Kay Eason. The final book that I will mention here in our little sci-fi interlude is What If 2 by Randall Munroe. This is a sequel to the book What If? And the subtitle here is Additional Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions. Someone will ask a question like, what if a Tyrannosaurus was standing on the back of a plane in flight? 747. What would happen? Or what would happen if you filled the solar system with soup? Out to Jupiter. What would happen if Japan simply disappeared? Things like that. And Randall Munroe talks to NASA scientists and physicists and all sorts of people who actually would know the answers to these kind of things, and talks about what would happen in these absurd hypothetical situations. I really enjoy this book. It's a very, very light read. I enjoyed What If and What If 2. Randall Munroe has a very easy comic style of writing that you can just breeze through, and some of these are just really interesting thought experiments. There's no real scientific value out of this. Maybe there is. Maybe it trains you to think more scientifically in some ways by being presented with absurd questions. But I just think it's fun. I just think it's fun for someone to say, like, How many nuclear bombs would you have to explode at the core of the Earth to actually, like, impact us on the surface? I don't know. How many would you have to explode? Would it be 3? Would it be 20 million? I actually don't have any frame of reference for how that would go about. So he figures it out. And it's just a quick, fun, light read. It's a great read for something like sitting in an airport. If you just want to read something and you don't want to think too hard, but you want to be entertained, but also have a little bit of, like, fun pop science in there, What If 2 might be your book. All right, so we are nearly to the top 5. I have one more book I'd like to review before we get to the top 5. And I'm going to call this my honorable mention because I almost wanted to put it in the top 5. I couldn't find it. I don't know. It was a tough competition this year. But it's a very good book that I read. It's Slouching Towards Utopia by Brad DeLong. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know one of my favorite topics is how did humanity get so rich? For most of humanity, we were poor. We were subsistence farmers, almost all of us. The idea that humans can be rich and wealthy and have our material needs taken care of is a very recent one. And it's important to know how we got there. How did the Industrial Revolution happen? Why are some countries rich and some countries are still poor? To me, this is one of the key questions in all of economics. Maybe the key question. And this is a book about that process. Basically, before 1870, the vast majority of humanity lived in dire poverty, and, you had some level of invention, but a growing population actually meant that, like, Malthusian forces were real. Even if we managed to improve technology a little bit, population would just explode, and, people might still starve because we just had more people now. But then, post-1870, a great shift happened, according to Brad DeLong, and invention started to sprint forward, and we started to grow faster than we ever had before, and basically the Industrial Revolution really took hold. And so the question is, how did this happen, and why aren't we at utopia yet? And Brad DeLong's thesis is basically that, we are getting to utopia, it's just going to take us a while. It's fundamentally an optimistic book. Despite the word slouching, it's fundamentally, I think, an optimistic book, in that Brad DeLong thinks we're going to get to utopia eventually, but it's not going to be via some masterstroke or some single revolution. It's going to be via incremental change and incremental change and incremental change, and we're going to have to continually deal with stuff. We're going to continue to have wars. We're always going to have recessions and periods of uncertainty and inequality. We're going to have to deal with climate change. We're going to have to deal with all this stuff. But that if we keep growth going and we keep technological progress going, we will continue to slouch towards utopia, towards a future where everyone can have enough and everyone can have their needs taken care of. It spends a lot of time on the history. It's primarily a historical book more than it is an economic book, and it has elements of both, but I would almost classify it as more history than economics. It has an impressive level of depth and research. It is a big book. It is, I don't know, 500 or 600 pages or something like that. I read a digital version, so I can't tell you exactly how many pages like the physical copy is going to have, but it is a chunker of a book. But I think it's a very good book. I'm glad I read it this year. I got to talk to Brad about it on the podcast. We will link those in the show notes. The podcast where I talk to the authors with Frank Fukuyama, with Brad, we'll link those in the show notes if you want to listen to those dedicated ones. But that is my honorable mention, a book that came up just short of the top 5, Slouching Towards Utopia by Brad DeLong. And with that, we've got to the top 5. We're going to start with number 5 and work our way up to number 1. These are the 5 best books of any kind that I read in 2022. Not just the second half of 2022, but the whole year. My top 5. Number 5 is a web serial by the name of The Wandering Inn. The central premise of The Wandering Inn is that there is this fantasy world with lots of different races. There's humans and there's lizard people and there's, like dog people and giants and trolls and all sorts of different types of people, goblins, and people from our world, our modern world, Europe and America and Japan and wherever else in the current year, basically, find themselves dropped into this world that they have no idea what's going on. It does not have modern technology. It has goblins and dragons and lizard people and magic and all sorts of that kind of stuff. And they have to figure out how to survive in this world. And the other central premise, beyond the central characters actually being from our world, is that this world has levels and classes. Literally as though it was a video game or a Dungeons and Dragons thing, people in this world actually have classes. If you spend a bunch of time baking, you will gain the class Baker and start to get like skills related to a baker, like quick rise dough as a skill, or, perfect flavor as a skill for a baker, something like that. I don't know a lot about baking, as you can tell. If you're a swordsman, if you get hired as like a city guardsman, you'll probably gain like swordsman as a class. And you might learn like deadly thrust as a skill. That, there's all sorts of stuff that you can do here. And everyone in this world has a class, sometimes multiple classes. And so the book primarily follows a character named Aaron Solstice, who is dropped in this world, finds an abandoned inn, and begins to become an innkeeper for lack of anything else to do. She starts to live in the inn and welcome guests and cook for them, and gains the class of innkeeper and starts to gain all sorts of special innkeeper abilities. And so it's interesting. The Wandering Inn starts out pretty slow, I would say. I actually tried to read it a couple years back, and got through the first 10 or 12 chapters and was kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm feeling it. I'm going to give up on it. I came back to it this year, and I continually have heard it referenced as one of the best web serials that's ever been written. It's always at the top of lists and things like that. It's famous or notorious, you pick your word. But so I came back to it this year, and I got through the first 10 or 15, which admittedly I don't think are very good. I think at the beginning of their process, the writer of this web serial was simply not a very good writer. But I think they improved significantly over time, and it is absolutely pretty fantastic now that I've gotten deep into it. I'm still not finished with it because the entire thing is absurdly long. It is something like put all 7 Harry Potter books together, and it's got something like 10 times the word count of those 7 Harry Potter books. It is like 70 Harry Potters, basically, if you just take one of the Harry Potter books by itself. It is I can't communicate to you how long, like each chapter is 10 to 20,000 words, which there's some books that are 10,000 words, frankly. So it's very, very long, but it's been publishing for years and years now. It's still not finished, and I'm not finished with it either. I think I've gotten through 7 of the 9 books, but it is an incredibly deeply realized world. The detailing of the world that they're in is rich, and there's all sorts of incredible history that you learn about it, and it's well written, and it makes you feel it gives you that feeling that the world is deep and fully realized and something you want to learn more about and explore. It's that kind of thing that grabs you in the way that great science fiction often does. It's hard to say too much more about it because it's such a wide-spanning epic of a thing. Eventually, they start to follow several other characters other than just the main character, but it's a great little series. Takes a little while to get into, but The Wandering Inn, something I would definitely recommend if you like web serials and fantasy and that kind of stuff. Give it a check. The number 4 book that I read this year was Plagues Upon the Earth by Kyle Harper. The subtitle here is Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Course of Human History. I read this one in the first half of the year, and we talked about it in our previous books episode. Plagues Upon the Earth is basically this wide, sweeping history of humanity from the perspective of how humanity interacts with diseases, with germs, with viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi, all the different things that can make us sick. It's very easy to talk about how diseases have shaped the course of human history. And they absolutely have shaped our history. If you think about things like the Black Death in Europe and smallpox and all of the plagues that went through all around the world, this is every civilization, the Middle East and India and China, Africa, Europe, the New World. If you think about how populations in the New World were wiped out by disease as a result of colonialism, it's undeniable that diseases have shaped the course of human history. And this book covers that. This book covers in great detail all of these really important diseases that have helped shape human history. What's less widely understood is that human history has also shaped diseases. This is not just a situation where the diseases have shaped us. We shape them just as much as they shape us. In fact, before humans, there really wasn't even as much of a thing as like great pandemic diseases, because for the most part, there were no world travelers before humans. And I'm simplifying here. Yes, there were some diseases that would probably spread all over the world. Yes, there were some animals that can travel long distances. But for the most part, there was very little back and forth between the remotest parts of southern Africa and Siberia, between the old world and the new world. A disease that started in one place mostly just stayed local to that place because things don't travel very fast. Until we get to human empires. Humans emerge at some point, and humans, early on still have that same profile. We don't really travel very far. We're hunter-gatherers. And so humans don't have a whole lot of pandemic diseases other than the very local ones. Maybe the biggest things are like having to deal with, parasites in your water or something like that. But things like smallpox, a lot of these diseases, you'd be very surprised to learn, are very recent in origin. So many of the diseases that we think of as the greatest killers are not diseases that existed 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, because there was no way for them to spread widely because humans didn't travel. And as humans began to travel, it became much more possible for diseases to spread widely. And so the development of human civilization actually changed the course of evolution for a lot of these diseases. There are really two factors here, I would say. Number one, it's the fact that humans built empires and could travel over very long distances. You could travel from India to China. You could travel from India to the Middle East. You could travel from the Middle East to Europe. All of these things started happening, and all of a sudden, syphilis can spread from India to China to the Middle East to Europe, and I'm just using that as an example. I do not know whether or not syphilis began in India, so don't get mad at me. That was just an example. If it makes you feel better, do it the other way around. Blame Europe. But that's one big factor. The other big factor is that humans, as we started to build civilizations, started to live in smaller and smaller geographical areas. We started to concentrate ourselves into cities. And when we were hunter-gatherers living in wide open spaces, it was harder for diseases to pass from one person to another because there's lots of space. But as we started to live in cities, as we started to live in cramped quarters right next to each other, in big buildings, or in closely, just close quarters, all of a sudden diseases started to spread like wildfire. All of a sudden diseases started to spread that had never spread before. And that's when you start to see more and more of these big pandemic, epidemic level events. I found this book just intensely fascinating. It covers almost every major instance of disease that humans have had to deal with, all the big ones, all your smallpoxes, your sexually transmitted diseases, your fungal diseases, your bacterias, your viruses, your polio, your this and that, and if you think about it, it's in the book. It was published in 2021, so there's only a little section at the end about COVID to answer that question. That it was probably written, being finished before COVID came around, and at the very end of the writing process, he had to include a little bit about COVID at the end as we were learning about it. But just overall, can't recommend this book enough. I loved it. It really made me change the way I think about how diseases and humans are really in this parasocial relationship where they hurt us, but we help them. But paradoxically, they would never have developed to hurt us if we weren't so successful in the first place. Absolutely love this book. The title, one more time, is Plagues Upon the Earth by Kyle Harper. The number 3 book I read this year was Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. So, Homage to Catalonia is Orwell's personal account of his time in the Spanish Civil War. George Orwell was a committed socialist, and the Spanish Civil War, which took place from, I think, 1936 to 1939, he left England and volunteered to go fight there with the Spanish Republican Army. Now, there were 2 sides to the Spanish War. There was kind of the nationalist side, which ended up being Francisco Franco becoming the dictator of Spain. The other side was called the Republican side, and they were essentially a left-leaning group that supported the current government. They had a bunch of socialists and anarchists and communists and all sorts, really, of different, like, splinter left groups all supporting the same cause, and they called themselves the Republicans. Now, what's interesting about this book is that it's one of the great anti-war books, I think, of all time, because it captures all of his frustrations with his experience fighting in this war. Essentially, he goes down there, and, you know, at the beginning of the book, it's all optimism and sunshine and cheeriness. And he's like, you know, oh, everybody was so happy. You know, the anarchists were in control of Catalonia and everything was beautiful and society was perfect for a little while. And I think it really encapsulates that spirit of leftism to kind of be like, if only you put us in charge, we would just instantly fix everything. And that's certainly what he thinks at the beginning of his experience. And then everything falls apart, of course. He actually goes into the fighting. And by the fighting, we mean that he spends a lot of time sitting in like ditches and sitting in trenches and doing nothing. No shooting, no fighting, not much happening of any kind. But he has to sit outside in a cold, wet ditch and watch people get gangrene and watch people, you know, lose their hope and just be miserable and sick and awful. And, you know, he talks about how they didn't really have any equipment. There might be 30 people manning this station, and like 15 of them will have a gun, and the other ones will just have sticks that look like a gun. And of the 15 that have a gun, you know, there's like 3 different kinds of gun, and they've only got enough bullets for 2 of those 3. So some people will have a gun, but they've got to mark a type of gun, I guess, that they've only got 7 bullets for. So there's just, you know, not everybody has good shoes. There's not really enough food to eat. It's very bleak about like the realities of having to sit and just do nothing in war. That war is long periods of miserable boredom. One of the other notable things about the book is that it's a book that almost perfectly highlights the tendency of leftism to destroy itself. He talks about many, many instances where the different factions that made up his side, you know, because the side he was fighting on was essentially kind of the socialist side versus the fascist side in the Spanish Civil War. But there were many, many different sub-factions. There was the POUM and the CNT and the PSAD or something. Like, there's all these different acronyms. You're going to get acronym like whiplash from how many different socialist groups there are. And what eventually causes him to leave the war is that those factions turn on each other. The socialists begin infighting, and there's literally like a civil war on just the side of the socialists in the Civil War. There's a civil war within the Civil War. And the socialists begin fighting each other. Like the Soviet-style socialists begin like stabbing the anarchists in the back, essentially, and stabbing the moderate socialists in the back and trying to seize everything. And I think this is where Orwell gets a lot of his bitterness, you know, towards like Stalinism from. That, you know, You think about things like 1984 and Animal Farm were both allegories for totalitarianism and Stalinism. And I think that this goes all the way back to the kind of Stalinist, communist side of the Spanish Civil War, kind of stabbing the other socialists and the anarchists in the back, according to Orwell's testimony. He eventually has to flee Spain, not from the fascists, but because the Soviet-style communists want to have him arrested for fighting with the wrong socialist faction. And so, it's hilarious how much of the book, when he's writing about this struggle against fascism, he left England, he left his reasonably comfortable life to go fight in someone else's civil war because he believed in socialism and he wanted to fight fascism. And he ended up getting chased out of the country, not by the fascists, but by a different kind of socialist. And it's just a like chef's kiss, perfect picture of how the left like invariably destroys itself and purity tests itself and infights and why they will never get anything done. So beyond that, it's instructive for those ways. It's instructive as an anti-war book. It's instructive as a picture of leftism. It's also just beautifully written. It's George Orwell. He's an unbelievably good writer, and he makes it very evocative, and you can really feel like you're there with him. So I definitely enjoyed reading this. It's a classic. You should read it if you haven't. Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. So we are down to the top 2 books, and I will waste no time in giving you number 2, The Origins of Political Order by Frank Fukuyama. This was the third Fukuyama book that is on the list. It's actually the first one that I read this year, and The Origins of Political Order is subtitled From Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. I absolutely loved this book. It's a book about what it says on the cover, The Origins of Political Order. And by political order, he means like statehood. Like as humans, as societies, we have developed a sort of complex ordering of our societies. We have developed political systems, whether they be monarchies or democracies or whatever, but complex political systems with bureaucracies, with the ability to control many different things, to control what's printed and what's spoken, what's communicated, where people live, how they gather, how they spend their money. We can tax them. We can regulate religions. These are all things that have happened throughout history, right? The state has become powerful. And the question of this book is, how did this happen? Virtually all human society used to be organized by tribes in tribal hunter-gatherer societies. And yet over time, we mostly abandoned tribal politics or like clan politics to develop political institutions, which are, including a central state. And this certainly seems to be the pathway of history. If you think, like Fukuyama does, that history is on a particular path, there's a direction to history, it certainly seems to be away from tribal societies and towards centralized states. So how did that happen? He literally starts this book before humans existed. He starts the book with like monkeys, with chimpanzees, and talks about how their societies are organized, because chimpanzees have little miniature societies. It's not exactly the same as us, but it's enough that he starts with that. He talks about the evolution into modern human, what early human societies look like, and painstakingly walks you through every step of how we moved away from tribal organizations into modern societies. He talks about the benefits of tribal organizations. Why did we use those organizations in the first place? Why did they develop? They didn't develop for no reason. They were useful for a time, for a set of reasons in the context of that time and place. There's a reason that they were pretty dominant, and there's a reason they were eventually abandoned. It is just a really, really good book. It is a little bit dense, but it's dense, I think, in a good way, in that it makes its case authoritatively. It is really well referenced. It is deeply researched, and it's just absolutely a classic of history and of academic writing. I think it's probably the best book Fukuyama has ever written. The Origins of Political Order. strong recommendation for this one. And finally, we come to the best book that I read in all of 2022, Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. So I think the best books are the kind of books that almost make you wake up to something, where you realize that you're agreeing with everything the author said and you're thinking, why have I never noticed this before? Why have I never noticed this pattern? Why have I never realized this series of things was connected? Those books are rare because, over time it's harder and harder to get surprised by new ideas if you've read a lot, but they're incredibly valuable. And this book was like that for me. I think that virtually nobody has been paying attention to the problems that boys and men have been dealing with in society. And Richard Reeves is one of the first serious academic thinkers that I've seen to try to tackle these problems head on. So first off, what are those problems? Boys and men are facing a number of problems that's disproportionately affecting them as opposed to women. This is things like violence in society. Most murder victims are men. Most overdoses, most deaths of despair are men. If you look at, who's overdosing on opioids and fentanyl, it's mostly men. If you think about, who is taking their own lives, if suicide is increasing in society, and it is, mostly men. You think about education. Boys are falling further and further behind at every level of education, middle school, high school, college. Girls are, I think it's something like in the high school class, the top 10% of GPAs, 2/3 of them are girls. And if you take the bottom 10% of GPAs, 2/3 of them are boys. And dropouts are overwhelmingly boys. And, girls are something like 60% of freshmen in college this year will be women. And it's not just that women are going to college more, but they actually have better rates of completion as well. So men are really struggling. Young boys are really struggling in education. And nobody talks about this. Or at least it's accurate to say nobody serious seems to be talking about this. The only people who talk about it are kind of right-wing grifters. People like Jordan Peterson, but who are ultimately kind of snake oil salesmen. And I'm really glad that we had someone, a serious, compassionate, liberal thinker like Richard Reeves to tackle this problem. Richard is also very careful to say that, this does not mean that because boys are struggling, it's women's fault. It does not mean that because boys are struggling, feminism must be reversed, or that women don't have issues. He would say something like, we can care about more than one thing at the same time. And acknowledging women's issues doesn't mean that you have to disacknowledge men's issues. And so I thought this book was incredibly eye-opening. I had no idea the extent of how bad certain things were, particularly in education. And I think Richard's description of the problem and his commentary on the problem are both incredibly valuable. He does a good job cataloging exactly all of the problems that boys and men are facing. And then he talks about, how did we get here and what do we do from here? He proposes a number of things that we should be doing, both very specific policies and very specific recommendations, and then broader cultural changes that he thinks we need. He thinks that we need to build a different version of masculinity, basically, that there used to be a playbook for how to be a man, how to be masculine, how to be grow into a real man, and this version of masculinity certainly had a lot of problems. A lot of it was based around the oppression of women and, based around a woman who would just stay home and cook and clean and raise the kids kind of thing. But it was a role. It was a designated role that men knew how to fit into. And it's good that we have kind of eradicated that kind of very oppressive system of women are stuck in a particular thing. And it's very good that we got rid of that. But we haven't replaced it with anything. And it is a problem because if you have someone who understands their role in society and is grown up to think that they have to fit this role and that they're prepared for this role, and then you yank it away from them and you don't give them a different role to play, they're going to struggle. And Richard thinks that's kind of what's happening with modern boys and men, that we haven't replaced the old bad paradigm with any useful paradigm. Women have a new paradigm. The paradigm for women used to be, you're a mother, you're a wife, you have children, you cook, you clean, you stay at home, you're domestic, blah, blah, blah. And that was replaced with kind of the have-it-all paradigm. You can be a mother and a wife, but you can also have a career. You can also be a scientist. You can also do your own thing. And certainly, look, there are complexities to that. That is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it is a new vision. There's a new vision of what it means to be a woman and how you can be a successful woman and fulfill yourself. And there's not a new vision of how you can be a new man. There's just kind of, be more like your sister, which is not a helpful piece of advice. And so in a broad sense, Richard desperately wants us to come up with a new positive vision of what it means to be a man that is not rooted in the old masculinity, but is like a new positive masculinity that still will be distinctively masculine, but can, be better for men as opposed to just the nothingness, the no guide, no plan we have right now. More specifically, he also has policy recommendations. He believes that all boys should be redshirted and held back from school for 1 year at the very beginning, starting in kindergarten, because boys' brains simply develop later than women's. This is than girls. This is scientific truth, apparently. It's not like I'm a brain scientist, but apparently it's just very well confirmed that boys' brains simply do not develop as fast as girls'. And, both science and anecdotal evidence, if you talk to any middle school teacher, who's more mature on average, your boys or your girls? Basically, all of them will tell you that the girls are more mature. I think that's just how the brain science works. And so he wants us to hold boys back for a year to set them up for more success in school. He wants to get more men into heel professions. There's a lot of focus on getting women into STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But the flip side of that is that if you're taking moving women out of their traditional roles and into STEM roles, then we've also got to do the reverse. Like the mathematics of that are that you must now be placing men into traditionally female roles. Roles like healthcare, education, arts, language, those kind of things. He calls the heel professions, and that we need more respect for those professions and more men in those professions, specifically in education. He wants there to be many, many more male teachers, and especially at the youngest levels, especially at elementary school levels, because something like 95% of elementary school teachers are women, and you don't want young boys to just learn that, school is a place for girls. School is a feminine place. It's not like that's an explicit message that we teach young boys, but it might be what they're learning if they never see a male teacher. So overall, just an absolutely fantastic book. It's good philosophically. It's good on the details. It's well researched. It's very compassionate. It takes men's issues seriously without falling into the weird anti-feminist, anti-equality stuff. So I really cannot recommend it highly enough. It was the best book I read this year, and it kind of made me think about the world in a different way. Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. So that's the episode. Thanks for listening. And as I noted, we're going to have a bunch of links in the show notes. I did podcast conversations this year with Frank Fukuyama, with Richard Reeves, with Brad DeLong. We'll have those episodes all in the show notes, as well as part 1 of the book's episode from earlier in 2022. One more time, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in a week.